Hey again, everyone. Welcome back to A Good Run with Daniel Feldman. I'm Alfred Feldman, and this is our 6th episode. Today we're covering Dan's first experiences working in City Hall via the Urban Fellows program. If you're a New Yorker, you'll probably appreciate one of these stories a bit more than the others, so keep an ear out for that one. Now that we're 6 episodes in, we want to hear from our listeners. We've set ourselves up on Spreaker to get these podcasts to you as soon as possible every other Tuesday, but also remember to reach out on our blog, agoodrunpodcast.wordpress.com, or on Twitter at agoodrunpodcast. And be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting app or service to get the next episode just as soon as it's posted. We're pretty much everywhere at this point. We'll be back again in 2 weeks with episode 7, but until then, enjoy this chat with Dan and myself. See y'all soon, and enjoy. Welcome to episode 6 of A Good Run Podcast with Daniel Feldman. I'm Asher Feldman. Thanks for sticking it out with us 6 episodes in. This week we're talking, myself and Dan, about kind of City Hall and its growing relationship in Dan's early life, and as he was at Columbia, how he kind of transformed his relationship with city government, I suppose, as he made his way through Columbia. So on the previous podcast, we talked about the riot and the police interaction between the Columbia students and the people who protested those few days in '68.
Right.
So I'm interested, before we really dig into your evolving relationship with City Hall, I guess in the aftermath, couple months later, how did you see maybe the relationship between the city and the students, or the city and people of your generation, around people around your age? Was it evolving? Was it changing? What did you see personally?
Ooh, that's a hard question to answer. Well, despite the fact that the Lindsay administration police had come onto the campus and essentially beat up our classmates, the blame for that really, I think the students blamed that on the president of Columbia, Grayson Kirk, primarily, not on Lindsay. Kirk had asked for the police intervention. Lindsay was, particularly among sort of progressive people, Lindsay was popular. Mm-hmm. He, was this relatively young, clearly progressive guy. Obviously, people like Mark Rudd were not going to be impressed. I mean, if you're a militant communist, then obviously, he's the liberal establishment. But if you're more of a sort of normal liberal, Lindsay was very attractive. I mean, especially in the context of the 1960s, because John Kennedy, as we've talked about, was this enormously inspiring figure for young people. He was assassinated in '63, and then Robert Kennedy, who was our next best hope, was assassinated in '68, as was Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and so forth. And so Lindsay was like the next hope, the next big hope. Mm-hmm. So I don't think there was a negative, at least for the most part, I don't think there was a negative, I don't think the student rebellion of '68 engendered a negative attitude towards City Hall particularly.
Okay. And do you think that for the most part people felt like City Hall had their best interests in mind? I mean, specifically on Columbia campus.
I think so. Again, let's sort of be a little more specific. A lot of students weren't paying any attention whatsoever.
Right, sure.
And of those who were, you had a normal range of political opinions. So students on the right, I imagine, didn't like Lindsay very much. Students on the far left certainly didn't like him very much. But I would think that where I stood, which is good of moderate left, was probably, if not typical, it was probably the median view.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think for people like me, City Hall was fine.
Cool. So then, after what happened those days in '68, did you feel kind of a impetus to kind of assert your involvement a little bit more clearly?
Well, I'm kind of embarrassed to admit this, but I wasn't really focused on City Hall either.
Okay.
I mean, the way I got involved with City Hall was I needed to earn some money to pay my way through college, and there's this thing called an urban core program where you got paid for working in city government. So I applied for the job.
So was your city government, that involvement in city government, like your first taste of government per se? I know that you talk in the blog a little bit about how you had become involved in kind of like dormitory student government.
Well, I was involved. Yes, I mean I had been involved in political campaigns, obviously from the time I was 7 years old. But this was other than student government. Yes, this was absolutely my first job in government. Yeah.
And how did that feel? Having grown up obviously in a condition where your parents are politically aware and active, you personally are politically aware and active, very much kind of trying to be the voice of a generation. You were one of the politically active people of that generation. How does it feel to finally step into those shoes, step into that door?
Well, I mean,
however small it was.
It was really, I mean, my job in government was, we did something, I'll explain in a minute. It was useful, but it was really pretty peripheral. I mean, it was like, it's hard to, it would be an incredible stretch to think that what I was doing was any, significant piece of government.
So what were you doing?
Well, I'm trying to remember the man's name. One of the people who worked for Deputy Mayor Costello, Tim Costello, whose office we worked at, came up with this pretty good idea, something called the New York City Urban Research Inventory. City government is a big government. There's like a lot of people working in New York City government, tens of thousands, or well over 100,000 actually, and a number of those people do research. They're trying to figure out, how to make the subways run better, how to improve health in the city of New York. There's a tremendous range of types of research. So there's a lot of research being done by city agencies. Also, in New York City, you have NYU, Columbia, Hofstra. I mean, you have so many, not Hofstra, not New York City, but NYU, Columbia, Fordham, so many colleges and universities. Obviously, a lot of research is being done there too. So the notion was, why don't we cross-pollinate? I mean, why don't we make the research on each end available and make people on each end aware of the research on the other end? Maybe we could avoid double work, and B, take advantage of work on either side that would be useful to the other side.
And to be clear, the two ends were the university spectrum and the city spectrum.
Exactly. Yes.
Got it.
So we actually created this publication called the New York City Research Inventory, which listed, as far as we were capable, every piece of scholarly research being done on both ends. And it was a good thing, but not, a major central issue in government, obviously.
Right.
So I was aware that I was working in city government, but it was a job. I mean, it was a good job. It was an interesting job, but it was just a job, really.
So for instance, what kind of research was keeping you busy in collating or organizing?
Well, I was calling university, academic departments. I was calling city agencies and getting them to tell me all the research they were working on, which they were perfectly happy to do.
What kind of stuff were they working on?
It was, frankly, what I remember most vividly was something that impressed me because it did not impress me. That is, I remember looking at all the dissertations that were being written for Doctor of Education degrees. And I thought, God, this stuff is just pointless nonsense. That of all the fields, that was the one that was, what the heck are these people wasting their time on? That may have been unfair, but that's certainly the impression I had at the time, which, although, as I said, maybe unfair, it hasn't actually been corrected
since.
It
hasn't changed much since.
Right.
So how long were you at that?
I did that. I believe it was both semesters. That would have been my junior year. That
Okay.
would have been, I guess, 68, 69.
Mhm.
Fall of 68, spring of 69. But for me personally, and in terms of deepening my involvement in city government, the most important aspect of that was uh, that that year, Sid Ginsburg and another fellow, I don't remember his name, came up with something called the New York City Urban Fellowship Program.
Right.
And that was what at the time for me was an incredibly generous stipend to work at a more serious level of city government. I mean, the internship I had was 20 hours a week. This was a full-time opportunity to work in a responsible position in New York City government.
So let's break it down a little bit.
Right.
So you're working in this research
Right.
consortium kind
Right.
of compendium
Right.
role.
Yep.
And then as you're working there, while you're working there, the urban fellowship concept is born
Yes.
and created.
That's right. And also out of that same office, also
Mhm.
out of Deputy Mayor Costello's office.
Mhm.
So to tell you, it was actually my mother that, I mean, I don't always notice what's going on around me. But my mother calls up and says, "Do you know there's this, urban fellowship program?" I said, "No." She said, "Well, isn't this something you ought to apply for?" I said, "Oh, yeah, I guess so."
So you applied for it.
So I applied for it. And I think the fact that I was already working in the deputy mayor's office, it probably gave me some handle on it, maybe an advantage. And I knew a lot of people. It was a very competitive program. I was very lucky to get into it. But I think the fact that I was already there was probably a plus for my application.
I'm sure. So how was the program described to you while you're applying? How was it kind of positioned?
Well, it was
for
described the way, pretty accurately.
Yeah.
It said this would be, you'd be working, there would be a matching process. It's sort of like the way they do
like
internship.
rotations?
Yeah, rotations for medical students now. That is, you would list your top priorities, which city agencies you would most like. Well, you get a list of the ones that have requested urban fellows, and then you'd apply. You'd list your top choices in order, and then you would interview, and then they would list their top choices among the fellows, and there'd be some match. You'd end up being assigned to wherever.
For the full course of the year?
Not necessarily. No, that could happen, but if the project you're working on ended, if for any reason you needed to switch, you could do that, which I did end up doing, not because my placements were in any way unsatisfactory, but because the project ended and it was better for me to do a switch. But in any case, so that's how it was described, and and also they said there would be weekly seminars, and it just sounded like a great program.
Yeah.
Which it was.
That's,
which it is, by the way. It still exists.
So do you happen to remember what your order of choice was way back then?
I don't, but what I do remember is how I ended up getting where I got. There's a professor at Columbia named Wallace Sayre. Sayre Kaufman wrote a book called Governing New York City, which remains to this day the only classic on that subject. Actually, people have suggested to me that I do an update, but the work involved would just be overwhelming.
Sure.
But anyway, the book came out in 1960 with a revised edition in 1965. I mean, it is the classic. So, of course, I went to Wallace Sayre and I said, Professor Sayre, I didn't know him, but he was a nice guy. I said, I have this fellowship to work in New York City government. Where should I work? So he said, I can't really advise you, but one of my students, one of my graduate students, is an assistant to the mayor, and you ought to talk to her. Her name is Marilyn Shapiro. Now, ironically, Marilyn Shapiro ended up being Liz Holtzman's administrative assistant at one point. Liz Holtzman was also an assistant to the mayor, as was a fellow named Lance Liebman. Marilyn did not suggest that I work for Liz. She said, you ought to talk to Lance Liebman, who's a very bright fellow who I know, and I think he's an assistant to the mayor for transportation. I think you'd have a good experience there. And that's exactly what I did. And I applied to work for Lance, and he said fine. And that's where I was initially placed.
So you to like kind of elucidate how this works for our listeners, you basically forego your senior year of college to do this?
Yeah, well, that was a bit tricky with Columbia because Columbia, unlike Harvard, unlike other schools, is incredibly stingy about credits.
Yeah.
So whereas other schools would give students, they said, "Oh, do this, write a big paper and you get a lot of credit." Columbia basically said, "You get 2 credits,
That's for the full year.
For the full year,
So what did you have to do?
Well, I went to summer school.
Oh, really?
I had like 2 credits left for my senior year. I'd actually gone to summer school after my sophomore year too. I don't remember why, but for some reason I did. So I had 2 summers in summer school, and that enabled me to enter my senior year essentially having completed all but 2 credits for graduation.
And these urban fellowship credits would be your 2 credits. Okay,
Yeah,
so you get chosen to work for transportation specifically,
Right.
deputy for transportation. Is that what?
No, Lance was the assistant to the mayor for transportation.
Okay, so what do you get working on as an urban fellow?
Well, the first, I don't know if it was Lance had 2 jobs. He was director of what was called the Mayor's Urban Action Task Force, which interestingly, it's interesting to me, I don't know if it's interesting to you, but New York City today has community boards. These urban action task forces were by community. They evolved eventually into what are now the community boards. And Lance was the director of that at the time. And so I did some work in that area. And I remember some complicated thing where I learned that, we talk about the Bronx as a borough and the Bronx as a county. Right. Manhattan as a borough, Manhattan as a county. Turns out the borders of the counties and the boroughs aren't necessarily the same. So there was a piece of New York County that was actually in the Bronx. And this was creating various problems, fire services and things like that. And so I remember, I had to work on I think we went to the legislature to change the boundary. I don't remember the details, but it was very interesting and it was surprising. So that was a small project. Right. But the main project that I ended up working on was in his other capacity. I did some other things from this task force. And as a matter of fact, I ended up meeting Janie Eisenberg, who was assigned to one of the community boards, I forget which, the task forces in those days. And she ended up marrying Jack Newfield, who I had experiences with later on, who was a great investigative reporter, but some problematic aspects there too. That's another story. But I think I also may have encountered Julia Rapport, who later became the manager of the community board in Rockaway, which will come into play later when I run for city council in Rockaway.
Yeah. So what are you doing?
But meanwhile, Lance said to me, look, I get all these proposals from people. Read through them and see if anything makes any sense. So I'm reading this proposal, and I'm always, to this day, I'm a little hesitant telling this story because, I'll get to the punchline right away. Many New Yorkers, for excellent reasons, hate the New York City Parking Violations Bureau.
Fair enough.
Anyway, in those days, parking tickets were handled by the criminal courts. And by 1968, the criminal courts were getting a little busy with other matters.
Yeah, I would imagine.
Yeah. And so, if leaving aside questions of ethics, from a purely practical point of view, if you got a parking ticket in those days, the most rational thing you could do from a self-interest point of view was to tear it up and throw it away, because the criminal courts were never going to get to it.
Right.
But this was creating some real problems. If you were in downtown Manhattan, which is where City Hall is and so forth, but if you're in that area, particularly where a lot of the streets are very narrow, God forbid you had a heart attack, the minute and a half that it ought to have taken you to go to Beekman Downtown Hospital could take 40 minutes because of the double parked cars. You couldn't get through the streets. Right. Nobody was paying attention to parking regulations. So I get this memo saying we ought to take enforcement of parking out of the criminal courts and put it into create a city agency to administer it. Well, I read the logic, I read the proposal, and I said, Mr. Liebman, those days, Mr. Liebman, I think he was. I don't remember if I called him Lance right away. Anyway, I think this proposal makes some sense. But I said, I'm not sure that the guy who wrote it, he was also a city employed engineer in the city. Robbins, Dick Robbins, I think his name is. I'm not sure that this man on his own could implement it. I think he may not have the practical, aspect of it. So Lance said, let me take a look at it. He took a look at it. He said, all right, go work with him, set it up.
The whole thing?
The whole thing.
You and like a city engineer?
Yeah. Created the New York City Parking Violations Bureau.
How does that happen?
Well, you break it up into different pieces. You have to worry about personnel, budget, real estate. I mean, you need a physical office. The OTPS, which is other than personal services. The machinery, the law. Well, first of all, you need state legislation.
Right.
I mean, there are all these pieces. You break it up into components, and then you get each piece done. Now, the PVB didn't go into effect that year. I did all the prep work.
Right.
So, but we planned the thing, and I think it was. I don't remember it was sometime in 1970 or 71. It was either the end of that year or the following year that the legislature enacted the legislation we needed to authorize cities to create such agencies. Because to take something out of the criminal courts and put it, you need legislation.
Sure. Yeah.
But then I had actually written. I wrote, which I had on my shelf for many years. I wrote the New York City Parking Violations Bureau Director's Handbook, which basically said how you set it up. But I was also talking to people about the real estate. I was beginning to negotiate the leases. I mean, I was doing everything I had to do to create this thing. How old was I?
21?
I turned 21. Yeah, I was 20 because I turned 21 in June of 1970.
Wow.
So at age, 20, I was doing this stuff.
I mean, I can only imagine how long that might take today.
Well, yeah. But it was, a pretty interesting experience.
Yeah. So how long are you working on that project?
Well, so I worked on that. Actually, I'm skipping a step because I worked on that, I think, in November and December, maybe January. So November 69, December 69, possibly January 69. I skipped something because in October, early October, I had been working for Lance for a month or so. He said to me, "You're interested in politics, aren't you?" I said, "Yeah."
Sure.
So he said, "Well, a friend, you may want to consider taking a month leave of absence from the fellowship program to work in the Lindsay re-election campaign, which was going on at this very moment." He said, "A good friend of mine is running one part of the campaign. Her name is Elizabeth Holtzman." And I said, "Yep." And so for about a month, I was very involved in Lindsay's re-election campaign. Liz Holtzman and a fellow named Win Kramarski, were running what they called the defensive operations in the Lindsay campaign. And I became their chief assistant. Mm-hmm. That meant that I was recruiting all the volunteers for again, what we call defensive operations. And I think that story is probably in the next blog, so I don't know if we want to take it.
Yeah, we
can deal with that next
gloss over it now. Yeah. But so you do a month for Lindsay under Holtzman.
Right, and election day was the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Right. So, beginning of November, I'm back working for Lance and doing the PVB project.
Right. And so then that's like November to
December, January, somewhere in there.
And then you transition to the next one.
Then having done that, I don't know, I really like working with Lance. Great guy, and we're still friends to this day. It's how many years later? 1970 to 45 years later, we're still friends. Well, he went off to Harvard. After the fellowship year, he went to Harvard as a professor, and I went as a student. So we both went to Harvard. But he then later on became dean of Columbia Law School, but he taught at Harvard for several years while I was there. Yeah. So after PVB, Lance, somehow we both agreed that I had a great experience doing the PVB thing. Why not try something else? Mm-hmm. There was I ultimately went back to Costello's office because they had a project which involved the goal was to anticipate, to predict, and to avert disasters in New York City.
What kind of disasters?
Well, that was it. I was supposed to figure out what kind of disaster was likely to happen, and then figure out a way to prevent it.
Okay.
And all I can tell you is that I did successfully predict one disaster, but I couldn't prevent it.
Which one was that?
It was the first major subway crash.
Oh boy.
Where people were, I think, seriously injured, and if I remember correctly, some even may have been killed. So I did anticipate it, but I couldn't figure out any way to prevent it. So my experience in that role was not productive, as far as I could tell.
Yeah.
But it was an interesting exercise.
Yeah.
Right.
So then you did that for a few months?
Yeah, I did that for basically the remainder of the fellowship.
Okay.
Yeah. But
so that's great. I mean, I think that really kind of coalesces all of the things and brings them together and kind of explains your first experiences. But that's like the policy and the productiveness side of it. What was, I'm sure a lot of this is about like the relationships that you make, the experience of doing it. What was that like as a person?
There were two different kinds of relationships. First of all, it became, both Liz and Lance are both friends of mine today. Yeah. So, I mean, that's, you certainly develop relationships.
I'm sure.
And in Liz's case, that ultimately helped my career path.
Which we'll get to
later on. But the other thing was it's important to me. I mean, it may not be political, but several of my the seminars that we had, the relationship among the 20 urban fellows, and I think it's more now, or at various times the numbers have gone up and down, but there were 20 in those years, and some very interesting people, and some of whom I've also remained my friends to this day.
Yeah.
But before I get to that, I mean, we had these amazing speakers, Lindsay himself, Jimmy Breslin, the great columnist, David Dirk. Now, that's a name that most people don't know. More people know the name Frank Serpico because of the movie of that title.
Sure.
But Dirk was Serpico's sergeant. And Dirk played, I would say as great, but certainly almost as great a role in uncovering the extent of police corruption in New York that led to the Knapp Commission and the massive reforms of the early 70s. But Dirk spoke to us in 1970, 2 years before this happened, and he wasn't talking about police corruption.
What was he talking about?
He was, well, let me tell you a little about Dave Dirk, and you'll see. Dave Dirk was a student at Amherst College and needed to make money to pay for his tuition. He joined the New York City Police Force after his freshman year, or sophomore year, I forget. I think freshman year. Thinking he would quit at the end of July and go back to school.
Right.
Discovered he liked being a cop.
More than he liked going to school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he said, if you want to be the 20th century, in those days it was still the 20th century, you want to be the 20th century version of a noble knight on horseback, become a New York City cop. He said, you don't have to be a standard cop. You can do what he did, which is give people summonses for violating pollution laws.
Right.
Then he said you'd get some people angry. Of course, Dirk got everybody angry, and it got in trouble all the time at that point. But he was basically doing good as a cop. He saw it as an avenue to just do good things. Now, as time went on, when he discovered the corruption, and he began focusing on that. Yeah. And so I was about to become a New York City cop. Except this was some 40 years prior to my cataract surgery. Turned out that if your vision is 20/800, which mine was at the time, you don't get to be a New York City cop. So
slight limiting factor.
Right. So that was off the table. But for a while, he had me going. I mean, wow. It was very difficult, I would say, to listen to David Dirk and not want to be a cop. Even. But then there was, I tell a little story about McGeorge Bundy. It was Bundy. It was McGeorge Bundy, who was one of the architects of the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And I should say that these dinners, these seminars for us urban fellows also included dinner and drinks.
Oh.
Unlimited drinks.
Oh.
We, unfortunately for future generations of urban fellows, our behavior ended the drinks end of it. And the reason,
in the first year.
Yes, the reason was that one of our fellows, Carl Settler, who was a great guy, good friend, liked to take full advantage of the drinking end of this. And when McGeorge Bundy was trying to justify the Vietnam War, Carl's response to each of his arguments was, bullshit, bullshit, expressed quite vociferously.
Right.
This is how the alcohol part ended.
Seems about right.
Right.
But it's amazing, you're exposed to all these fascinating people,
Oh,
plus
so
the
many
people in the
more.
room sitting next to you
Yes.
are
Yeah.
equally intelligent.
Yeah, I
fascinating.
mean, probably our most famous one was Leon Botstein, who was the youngest college president in American history. He's founded the American Symphony Orchestra, founded and conducted the American Symphony Orchestra, was president of Bard College, but became a college president within like 5 years of the Open Fellowship program. Sherry Suttle was the first black woman city manager. Various, all very
all sitting in that same room with you. Every once a week for these seminars.
Yes, right. Yeah, and we socialized. We became good friends. Mary O'Brien is still a close friend. Dave O'Connor.
I mean, to me, it's amazing that like something that had just started the year that you did it was already so well.
You have to understand, Lindsay was a national. It wasn't just New York City. Lindsay was perceived as the next Kennedy.
Yeah.
Nationwide. I mean, when I was a few years earlier, when I was at the Mount Herman School on a National Science Foundation program while I was in high school, my girlfriend in the program, Nancy Roth, who was from Minnesota, was telling me that they out in Minnesota, they were looking to Lindsay to be the next. Well, he was Republican, of course, at the time. He ended up being a Democrat, but at the time he was Republican, and her family was Republican, and they saw him as the next great, American leader, right? As a liberal Republican. In those days, there were a lot of liberal Republicans.
Right.
There aren't anymore, but before that. So, I mean, people, these people from the fellowship that I'm talking about came from all over the country, and they were attracted because of Lindsay. The opportunity to work in that administration was a big draw.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating. I mean, to have someone so attractive, even way back then, when city politics is not like the most glamorous thing.
Well, Lindsay was also
good looking, right?
Extraordinarily good looking.
Right.
I don't know if while I didn't know this at the time, but apparently, roughly in those years, in the district that I was much later to represent as an assembly member, the city decided to open a center for developmentally disabled in Manhattan Beach, which is the wealthiest part of that district.
Right.
And apparently the matrons of Manhattan Beach were all picketing, not in our neighborhood, down with Lindsay, whatever. And Lindsay showed up. And one by one, the signs came down. They were not, oh my God, he's so gorgeous. But unfortunately, Lindsay, for a number of different reasons, maybe it's a little bit his fault, but I still like him. It crashed and burned as a political leader. His presidential campaign was one of the most unsuccessful ever,
Well, I mean, at least at that time.
At that time, there was great hope for him. Yeah, he was.
That's great.
And by the way, we had interaction with him as fellows, and he was just wonderful guy.
Yeah,
really great guy. But I'm leaving out Herman Kahn, who was a great intellectual, right? A great intellectual. We had all these seminars with amazing people. It was really quite an experience.
Yeah. All right, I think we'll leave it there for this time. And I'm sure we'll dive into many of these aspects as you had brought up in the next couple of episodes.
Terrific.
All right, so we'll see you all next time.